wow, what an amazing documentary. This is just the first part. This is the first time I've seen it. I'm joined, of course, by LA Times Deputy Sports Editor Ileana Limon Romero. And Ileana, we gotta prop ourselves. What other documentary about Fernando Valenzuela will have Danny Trejo, Little Willie G from the Midnighters, the legendary Chicano rock and roll band, Richard Montoya from Culture Clash, and then the worldwide debut of former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa with a Mexi mullet that would make like the one from Los Tigres del Norte look like a buzz cut.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Also you, which is exciting. And I think it's fantastic. I love the first episode. Now I want to binge watch all of it. So cool.
Oh my God, yeah. Folks, this is just the first part. We're gonna go. I've seen the script. I haven't seen the entire show, but we're gonna go into his history in De Sonora, going through his trajectory through the minor leagues into the major leagues, all of that great stuff. But Ileana, and it's interesting because myself, I did not live through Fernandomania. I would have been it was 81, so I would have been 2 years old. But I was definitely, and I wrote this in an essay for for the LA Times. If you're a subscriber, you read it, just about the aftermath of Fernandomania. I was of that generation where he was still a saint. I know a lot of you folks have seen that votive candle of Fernando as St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of lost causes. Ileana, what were your memories, especially coming from Texas, from El Paso? What were your memories of Fernandomania?
Yeah, so I'm from El Paso, Texas, and I was also about the same age. So the first year, I have to be very clear, was not able to catch all of it. But then later on in his career, particularly 88, 89, I sat and watched games with my grandfather. He would turn it on. He'd wear his Dodgers jersey. He was really excited about it. He got swept up in Fernandomania and was part of a large Mexican-American community in El Paso that was all about it. Absolutely Dodgers faithful. My Nino, my sister's Nino, godfather, named his dog Sandy after Sandy Koufax. They were just all in. And so it just took over in the exact same way. You see murals in Los Angeles, you see murals in El Paso.
That's awesome because, of course, here being, Los Angeles, Dodgers country, whatnot, we forget many times that there's Latinos all across the United States, Mexicanos all across the United States. So it's interesting to see also that happening in El Paso. And as a follower on Twitter actually reminded me, Fernandomania itself, actually, you could argue it started in Texas, in San Antonio, when Fernando was in the Double-A team up there.
Yeah, absolutely. There was time there, and there was time also in West Texas. He spent a lot of time going through there, and we're really excited about helping tell that story, the Texas chapter of his career. They claimed him in San Antonio as well. They absolutely loved him where he spent part of his time, and then later in his career, as things wound down, he had another stretch, and it was still mania. It didn't matter that he was getting older, that things were fading. He was absolutely a huge draw, a massive draw. We're excited about telling those stories the rest of this Dodger season as we celebrate it all year long.
And what's the importance yourself as a deputy editor, as someone who has been working, covering sports for your career? What's the importance of telling something like this? This is something that happened 40 years ago. We're talking about a baseball player who had a great couple of seasons, but not enough to make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Why should people care about this?
He's such an inspirational and transformational figure. I think it was a way that people identified. We touched on it a bit in the first episode of this docuseries, and I think it's part of the story that we're going to continue telling all year. I think it really connected. It's someone that you could have pride in. It's someone that meant something to you. It was someone who was from your culture, from your backgrounds. There was no question that he was Mexicano. Like, you could see that from start to finish. Hardworking, humble, quiet. Those are all traditional values and things that we could all aspire to. And so it just never faded. It's hard to say why it was never overtaken. And I'm excited about talking more about that aspect from a lot of different perspectives, but it just resonated. And telling those stories that people so richly identify with, culture, place, their hearts, their souls, like, that's the best part of storytelling. So we unquestionably feel like this is a great place to be and a great space for us to continue reporting all season.
Yeah, and it's a story that still continues. Fernando, of course, is color commentator on the Dodgers television broadcast. The real G's know that he loves to play golf at the Montebello Golf Course. Miguel Santos runs into him all the time there, along with his brother-in-law, the son-in-law, Chuck. Like, he is just one of those beloved figures. And so to talk a little bit more also from his perspective, we're joined by our special guest, Dr. Richard Santillan. He is, I said earlier, he is the author of all these great books about Mexican American baseball in Southern California. We're talking about the before Fernando era. We're talking about los choriceros of East LA. We're talking about the Zacatecano leagues that play there at Excelsior Park in Norwalk. I mean, this is the man who knows Mexican American and Latino baseball in Southern California better than anyone. So, Dr. Richard, if you're here, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Eliana and Gustavo, for allowing me to be part of this extraordinary series.
What did you think of what you saw in the documentary?
Oh, I just got so excited. I mean, I'm really looking forward, like Eliana, I'm really looking forward to looking at all this history of Fernando Mania. As I was watching it, there were several things that crossed my mind. One, Gustavo, was when you said you were like only 2 years old at when Fernando Mania. I was there at Dodger Stadium in 1980 when Fernando pitched his first Major League Baseball game for the Dodgers. When he came out, there had already been talk about him possibly pitching at the end of the 1980 season. That's when they bring up all the players for a cup of coffee. I was there in 1981 on opening game when Fernando pitched for Jerry Royce. And a few years later, my wife and my younger son, we were there in 1990 when Fernando pitched his no-hitter against the St. Louis Cardinals. So, and we saw many, many Dodger games. Every time Fernando pitched, we were season ticket holders since 1977 until 2018. So every time Fernando pitched, we would always go to see him at Dodger Stadium, and it was quite an experience to see him play. The other thing I wanted to mention, a couple of things, maybe 2 or 3 things very quickly, and maybe we could discuss them later, is that Fernando Mania can't be seen in isolation. Mexican Americans have been playing Major League Baseball since the 1880s, when Vicente Nava became the first Mexican American player to play in 1882. And there have been dozens and dozens of Mexican Americans who have actually done some very important historical things, contributing to the rich history of the American pastime that we don't know too much about. And part of our book series and part of our Mexican American Baseball History Project is to bring to the public this extraordinary and deep, profound history of Mexican Americans in baseball. And so, even though Fernando, deservedly so, receives all of this credit, Fernando Mania, there's no doubt that he radically revolutionized baseball. My first Dodger game was at the Los Angeles Coliseum in 1958, in May of 1958, only a month after the Dodgers came here from Brooklyn. I used to go to Dodger games at the Coliseum, in high school at Dodger Stadium in 62, 63, 64.
Did you ever catch a moonshot?
Yeah. I saw Wally Moon, Don Demeter, Charlie. The only reason I mentioned that real quick is that I experienced firsthand what baseball looked like before and after Fernando. I mean, I saw baseball up until 1980, and then of course 81, and he revolutionized baseball. Baseball was never the same after Fernando in 1981, and it's still not the same. Fernando's baseball fingerprints, his legacy, still continues in so many ways in baseball way after he retired. There are still things happening in baseball. The evolution of baseball changed after Fernando. It's become more Mexicanized. It's become more Latinized. And we can attribute that going back to Fernando Mania.
We have an audience question that kind of comes along those lines that I think would be really good to address. It's from Valerie Sanchez. She wanted to ask, why do you think Fernando Valenzuela became so popular when other Latino players came before and after him? Why did he take off? Why did that take hold so much?
You know, I have a theory that's not often presented as to why that happened. But in the 1970s, the very emotional issue of undocumented immigration was tearing this country apart. There were many pieces of legislation. When Fernando was born in 1960, the Bracero program was still being implemented between the United States and Mexico. And when Fernando was 5 years old, the Bracero program came to an end. But what the United States did with Mexico's permission was to create the border industrialization program, which basically built American plants throughout the northern border of Mexico, the border cities. And as a result of that, millions of Mexicans, Mexicanos, from the interior of Mexico came to the border, and millions of them crossed across into the United States without papers. And so by the 1970s, we're hearing derogatory terms like illegal aliens and so forth. And in the 1970s, going up until 1978, 79, there was a lot of tension between Mexico and the United States. There was a lot of tension. Relations between both countries were at the lowest before World War II. But then what happened was that most of the legislation was punitive, building a wall, an internal passport for Mexicans, quotas, renewing the Bracero program again. And then Fernando comes along in 1980. And I think that both Mexican Americans in this country and Mexicanos in Mexico were relieved to see that the discourse, the conversation for the last 10 years began to focus more on something very positive. And that was Fernando.
It was definitely like, finally, after not even just a decade, we're talking about this since the 1848 Mexican-American War, you're seeing a Mexican being like the top of the top, someone that not just Mexicanos can appreciate, but everyone is worshiping. Fernando really was a savior in that sense. And just to get back to sort of the historicity of the question, you had people like Roberto Clemente, you had Luis Aparicio, who of course was with the White Sox, all Hall of Famers, Luis Tia, of course, the great mustachioed pitcher with the Red Sox.
Yes.
The first two were Hall of Famers, the other ones, but they were playing in cities with, at the time, especially Pittsburgh, had a very small Latino market or population. White Sox, they had a long Mexicano, but he was Venezolano. No one had really resonated as a Mexicano, as a Latino in Southern California until Fernando did.
No, you're absolutely right. And what happens in 1981, with all of the popularity of Fernandomania, and you're right, Gustavo, is that Fernando is often seen as appealing to Mexicans, but he appealed to so many baseball fans who really appreciated white baseball fans, black baseball fans, Asian American baseball fans. What Fernando did transformed baseball to all the fans. But what happened in 1981, if you remember, or maybe you don't remember since you were like only 2 years old, is that President Ronald Reagan invited Fernando to the White House. And he invited, of course, the president of Mexico, Jose Lopez Portillo y Pacheco, in 1981. And Fernando went. And every Mexicano, Mexican American on both sides could not believe that Fernando Valenzuela, this young man, was in the White House with the two presidents of Mexico. And Ronald Reagan was a big baseball fan. He had reenacted Chicago Cubs games with WGN when he was in Chicago. He played Grover Cleveland Alexander, a Hall of Famer, on the big screen. And he said, to Fernando, you are a great pitcher. And after that, and members of the Congress, the senators and House of Representatives are all fighting to get Fernando's autographs and to get his picture. I mean, this is, Fernandomania wasn't just on baseball. It was impacting social and cultural and politics in this country. And so after Fernando leaves the White House, the entire conversation around immigration changes from punitive to a path to citizenship. And in 1986, Reagan signs, the Immigration Control Act, and over 3 million undocumented people become American citizens. I mean, so so Fernando's impact on baseball, on what he did to baseball, but what he did culturally and politically in this country is often overlooked.
I love your theory. I don't think it's a theory. If it wasn't for Fernando, we wouldn't have amnesty. That's a good one. That's a good one.
We would not have had amnesty.
You can just see the looks on our faces, like delighted to hear this interpretation and this insight. Really, really appreciate taking us through this. Let's go to an early part of Fernando's career. He threw the famous screwball pitch. Then we have a reader question a little bit about it from Jason Garcia. He wants to know, how important was Bobby Castillo in Fernando's development? And so taking a look back, who taught him the screwball? How did this all come together before, as he burst on the scene and was able to dominate these games? How important was he?
Okay. I'm sorry, Liana, you're asking me that question, or?
Yeah,
Anyone,
absolutely.
yeah.
If you want to start, let's go ahead. What do you recall
Gustavo,
from?
I want to hear. I like to hear from Gustavo. Do you have any?
Yeah, but Bobby Castillo was a Chicano. He was a Mexican American from Southern California. And the way the story goes, and you're going to see it, of course, in the documentary, he was of course, never a Hall of Famer, never, what they call a journeyman pitcher. And he was the one who was tasked with showing Fernando, who at that time was a prospect, but there didn't seem to be that much, like, people didn't know what was going to happen. But here's here's this pitch, a screwball. And if you know anything about baseball, I'm assuming you do because you're seeing this. The screwball is one of the most vexing pitches that anyone can throw, but it is also one of the most taxing pitches. In other words, it really messes up with your thing. It's a backwards curveball, basically. Already as a left-hander, you're a little bit odd in the baseball game. Throwing a screwball like that, I mean, the only other famous, and of course the prophet's gonna correct me on this, but the only other famous screwballer that I know was Carl Hubble from the New York Giants. We're talking about the 1930s. He had a famous feat that during an All-Star game, he struck out five Hall of Famers, actually. I can't name them all right now, but one of them was Babe Ruth. I think another was Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, I think. But 5 Hall of Famers in a row. Fernando would replicate the exact same thing all these years later with that screwball of his. So yeah, Bobby Castillo is that great unknown, if not a hero, at least that catalyst that made Fernando happen.
Right. Yeah, and he's he's one of the persons I have on my list, as I mentioned about the unsung heroes, Mexican Americans who came before Fernando. But now, as you mentioned, then you have with Bobby Castillo. I did want to add something, Ileana, and to Gustavo. I believe in this series, I believe you might have interviewed Ray Lara, who's the head baseball coach at Lincoln High School. And he played for Lincoln High School. He was a pitcher, Ray Lara, and probably one of the closest people to Fernando. Today, he's one of the closest people with Fernando. If you see Fernando, you see Ray Lara. They're almost like cuates. They're almost like twins. And so if you listen to Ray, and obviously, the nice thing about baseball is that there's always so many different stories. But Ray has a story about how he taught Fernando the screwball. So hopefully by the end of this series, we'll ask Fernando, if it was Bobby Castillo or Ray Lara who did it. And if we could answer that question, the whole series would have been worth it.
I have notes from our producers. I have notes from our producers. Those interviews are coming. They're in it. So you can expect to get the answer to that question during the course of our series. We are on
at least we could say it's from the East Side. Someone from the East Side taught Fernando the screwball.
Yes. And both from the same high school.
That's awesome.
There you go. So, Profe, we have a streak that we have to recognize that I'm told is continuing tomorrow. You've been to every Dodgers home game for the past, this will be 45 years, is this correct?
45 years. Tomorrow is my 45th.
And what did you do last year when they were in the pandemic? How did you handle that?
My wife and I, we actually went to Dodger Stadium, and the gates were closed. There were some other Dodger fans there that had gone to quite a few opening games, not as long as our streak, although I think there was somebody actually who had it almost, I think, over 50 years. So we were all kind of saying that because we were there, and we were actually there for opening game. I mean, the pitch. I mean, they were playing the game in the stadium, and they actually did the opening pitch, and we were there physically outside the stadium. So we all agreed that we would count it as part of our.
It counts. It absolutely counts.
Yeah, to do it. But it's a family tradition, and so my children and my grandchildren. My grandchildren now are in their 20s, but they've been going to almost every Dodger opening game since they were born. So it's a family tradition. Now, 2 of my grandchildren, both of them who are going to Cal State LA, online right now, they'll be with us tomorrow. So it's kind of exciting. But thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so with that in mind, we have a question from Steve Padilla, one of our colleagues who had asked on Twitter. He wants to know, how much did Fernando's presence change the stands at Dodger Stadium? How much did the crowds change as a result of him blowing up and the height of Fernandomania? I can tell you that my grandfather, my abuelo, was one of the people who went from El Paso, headed over. But Roge, you were obviously there the whole time. What can you tell us about what you saw?
Yeah, I think that Fernando had such a extraordinary impact on the ethnic composition of ball games. I mean, I remember listening to Vince Scully as Fernando went back to play the New York Mets, and they were playing the Pittsburgh Pirates and so forth, and that there were like 15, anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20,000 fans that would just walk up on the day that they knew he was pitching, and many of them were Mexican Americans. I remember at the time, the number of Mexican flags that you saw at ballparks, even on the East Coast or in the Midwest, Mexicanos coming in, wearing sarapes and so forth. I mean, showing their pride. I think Gustavo had mentioned earlier that there was it's true that there was a small population in Pittsburgh, but Gustavo, you mentioned that there were a lot of Mexicans throughout the country. You're right. When Fernando pitched, even before he pitched in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, there were significant Mexican populations in 46 of the 50 states. I mean, Mexicanos went to go work in the auto plants and the steel mills, and they went to go, they worked in agriculture and so forth. And they were baseball fans. When Mexicanos came in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, they played baseball in Mexico. Mexico's Major League Baseball started in 1925. Big baseball fans. They went to Yankee Stadium. They went to Forbes Field. You know, they went to all the different ballparks in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. Mexicanos. So when Fernandomania came up, I just want to mention several things happened. One, ballparks began to hire people. They began to hire parking lot attendants who spoke Spanish. They began to hire ushers who spoke Spanish. People who sold the food, people in gift shops. They began to hire Spanish-speaking persons. They began to sell Mexican food. That's one of the biggest changes I saw with Fernandomania in 1981. Was they began to, I mean, King Taco, they gave King Taco this huge place in the reserve section, and there were so big lines there, you could not believe it. King Taco right there in the reserve section on the left field side.
King Taco, the legendary taco chain from Los Angeles, just in case you're not from Southern California.
Taco and Mexican beer. But you know, the other thing Fernando did is he forced newspapers and radio stations and TV stations and news sporting sports writers and so forth to go out and hire Spanish-speaking people. I mean, sports writers. I mean, you take a look, and I remember in 1982, 83, 84, you began to see on the news the sports commentators, and more of them became Mexican Americans on Channel 2 and Channel 4, Channel 7, Channel 9 in Los Angeles. Sports writers for the LA Times, for the Herald Examiner, the San Gabriel Valley Tribune. People wanted to speak to Fernando. The other thing that you saw too was Major League Baseball began to hire hundreds of baseball scouts. The Milwaukee Brewers, the New York Mets, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Cincinnati Reds, they wanted, as Jaime Jarrin pointed out, they wanted another Fernando Valenzuela. They wanted another Roberto Clemente. And so baseball scouts became more browner and browner as in fact, most Major League Baseball teams during Fernandomania established what they called their Latin American Scouting Bureau because of Fernando. And that still exists today. In regards to the scouts, when you take a look at Hispanic night, Mexican night, mariachis, even another theory of mine, where we see the left arm of Fernando in terms of Fernandomania, even way after he retired from baseball, is now the Spanish accent marks on the Spanish surnames behind the jerseys. You know, people talk about that as if this was, again, something done in a vacuum or this is just part of the evolution of Fernandomania over 40 years ago. Whenever there's a revolution in any kind of sport, that wave continues for generations. And you know who sees that? Julio Urias, For example,
Gonzalez.
Victor Gonzalez, both claim that they got in baseball because of Fernando. Because of Fernando. 40 years after, you still see this amazing impact that Fernando's having on young Mexican players.
And shout out to the Culichis who all, respect Julio Rias, people from Sinaloa, and to all the Coras from Nayarit, where Victor Gonzalez is from. Tuxpan,
Yes.
I believe.
Yeah, and the apparel. Fernando baseball caps. I'm wearing Fernando's jersey. I'm wearing his 34 jersey right now in honor of Fernando. But his jerseys, the Dodgers in 1981 began inserting Spanish-speaking inserts into the programs. They did a yearbook, a Dodger yearbook in Spanish. They started doing Dodger schedules in Spanish. They put those Dodger schedules at the Union Oil 76 gas station, 7-Elevens in East LA, in English and Spanish. And so, I mean, it changed their whole marketing, the Dodgers. It changed scouting. It changed broadcasters. It changed the fans. I mean, when I went to the Dodger games in 1977, 78, there were very few Mexican or Spanish-speaking fans in the audience. And a lot had to do with about the video. And that was in terms of what happened in Dodger Stadium, Chavez Ravine. But Fernando did bring fans back. It was something. It was an affirmation that Mexicanos. I think Gene Aguilera said it, that in a way people sort of set it aside a little bit and went to go see Fernando pitch.
And then not only that, it wasn't just Mexicanos. Of course, Fernando opened the gates for everyone. For
Everyone.
Hideo Nomo, the great Japanese pitcher, Chan-Ho Park, the great Korean pitcher. I'm from Orange County, but I love going to Dodgers games because when I go into the stands, my ideal LA is all there. Literally, you see all ethnicities, everyone coming in, wearing their jerseys, in Chinese script, in Hangul, the Korean script, in whatever it is. The last time I went to a Dodgers game, I think it was 2019, obviously, but I think it was Filipino night, which I'm like, hey, salamat to everyone. Like, that's awesome. Like, that you're seeing all these fan bases and Dodgers. And it's the irony, Ileana, maybe you could talk about this, the irony that the Dodgers, who was born in the LA of the original sin of pushing out an ethnic group, now is seen as like the epitome of a franchise that gets that diversity is important, not just for its players, but also for its fans.
Gustavo, one thing you mentioned was Jackie Robinson nationalized baseball for African Americans, but Fernando internationalized baseball beyond Mexico. And your examples of Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, you're absolutely right. In fact, my sense of it is that in many ways, one can argue that what Fernando did was equal to or exceeded the impact that Jackie Robinson had on American baseball.
That's your theory, not ours.
Wow.
So, Ileana.
Wow, that's a big one. That's a big one. I just think it's just that pride. It's that pride and that recognition that I think comes a lot with it, and that's why it resonates in incredible ways. I have a couple of technical notes for our audience. We so appreciate you joining us. I had heard a few of you might have had some technical difficulties early on or hadn't been able to see the video. I want to let you know that it will be available tomorrow for replay. You will get a link if you were watching this. If you signed up for it, you will absolutely get it. But we've been showing it on the screen occasionally, latimes.com/Fernandomania. Very easy to remember. That's where the entire video series is going to live, and you can replay this episode. Along those lines, we had a question from Paula Marcial, Paula asked, what are the plans for the series to be available in Spanish? Obviously, we had to do that. So when these episodes drop, they will also be on the LA Times YouTube channel, and we will have Spanish subtitles available. In addition, Gustavo's column that just went live on Wednesday in the Los Angeles Times on our front page, and all of the other work that we're doing throughout the season, we're going to be doing it in English and Spanish. We'll be making them available. It's not instantaneous. It does take us some time to turn around the production, but you can look out for those. And the last step, I'm really excited about working with our Espanol team to make sure that they're doing original reporting and that we will be showcasing, and then we will also translate that back into English because we want you to get all aspects of this story all season. So Again, latimes.com/Fernandomania. That's your place to get started. And we appreciate you sticking with us for this conversation. Even if you missed the video, it was amazing. You get to watch it as many times as you want tomorrow, I promise. So getting back into the conversation from there, I think the most common question I've had, whether it is from Mexicanos, any age group, any background, Dodger fans in general, this is from Paul Dillon. Why haven't the Dodgers retired Fernando Valenzuela's number yet? So, Gustavo, do you want to start us off with any theories about why no one has worn the jersey yet, to my knowledge? So, why hasn't it been retired?
Yeah, I mean, come on, Dodgers. It's time to do so. You should, I mean, I know the Dodgers never want to copy what the Angels do, because who really wants to copy the Angels in anything, really? Except in this. The Angels, they have retired the jerseys of two people who are not in the Hall of Fame. Usually when you think about retiring the numbers of a ball players, because they're, Hall of Famer, legend, just dominated their career. But the Angels, they retired the numbers of Jimmy Reese, of course, a long-time hitting coach for them, long time. And also they retired, I think it was the number 25 or something. They made up a number for Gene Autry, the founding owner of the Angels, the singing cowboy. And so they retired his. And I think that was perfectly fine, because Jimmy Reese was a clubhouse legend for the Angels, also beloved by the fans. Everyone loved Gene Autry. That's like the biggest regret for Angels fans, that the singing cowboy was not around. I think he died the year right before the Angels won in 2002. Right. So it makes no sense for the Dodgers. It's great that they haven't allowed someone to wear number 34, but come on, Dodgers, it's time to retire it.
Profe,
what do you think, Profe?
Well, the Dodgers have this policy that, you're right, they only retired numbers of players or coaches, managers who are in the Hall of Fame and who spent most of their years with the Dodgers. That's has been their criteria. There's only been one exception to that, and that is, I remember when Jim Gilliam died. He was right before the 1978 World Series, just a couple of days before he died, Jim Gilliam, and so they made an exception. They retired his number, but there's like a little even exception to that, and that is that in the future, if the family agrees, they can basically take that number out, number 19, for someone in the family. If he has a son or grandson, or hopefully one day maybe even a great granddaughter, to wear number 19. This brings up a point, because this is often asked about why Fernando isn't in the Hall of Fame either. I mean, why isn't his number and so forth? And unfortunately, is one thing about baseball, even to this day, and even more so today, is baseball is just so consumed with numbers, with metrics. Now today, there's like a million different metrics that baseball uses to try to find what is the value of players and so forth. I mean, there's just one statistic after another on top of another, on top of another. And so what baseball has done in terms of the Hall of Fame, they used to do it, they still did it before, but now it's even getting worse. And that is that they're using a lot of statistics and metrics to use, and the same thing with Fernando's number being retired by the Dodgers, is he in the Hall of Fame? Did he spend his time with the Dodgers? I think what's often overlooked by Major League Baseball, by the Cooperstown, by the Hall of Fame, and by the way, most of the people in the Hall of Fame on the committees, even in the old timers committees, they call them era committee now. There are no Mexican Americans. There are no Mexican Americans in the Hall of Fame. I mean, there's Latinos, primarily Puerto Ricanos, from the Dominican Republic, from Venezuela, from Panama, but there isn't, it's to my knowledge, a Mexican American in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And if you take a look, at the composition of the committees that determine and the Hall of Fame, Mexican Americans are almost invisible. And so Fernando, it's an East Coast bias in some part. It's statistically driven, and so they claim there are some people already who have looked at Fernando's numbers and say his numbers don't match many people, other pitchers who are not in the Hall of Fame, who have better um, numbers than Fernando. But what's often overlooked with baseball, because baseball is, like I said, driven by numbers and stats, is what impact did Fernando have on this country? Well, how did he revolutionized baseball? How did he bring millions and millions of fans, generations of fans, and impacted players in other countries and so forth, and change the cultural and linguistic landscape of baseball? I mean, Fernando single-handedly changed baseball forever. He made it more cultural, Latino, Latina, more Spanish speaking. And yet he on that alone, he will never be given the privilege or the honor of being in the Hall of Fame, because baseball doesn't look at that. Baseball is afraid to address any kind of issue that takes a look at politics or culture or language or social change or empowerment or prejudice or discrimination or urban replacement, any of those things. And so baseball keeps itself very safe by saying we are not prejudiced, we are not discriminatory. We look at the numbers, and the numbers don't have anything to do with anyone's ethnic, cultural background. So we're not prejudiced or discriminatory. And that kind of view is never going to serve the Mexican American community, as it's never served any other community well, especially communities of color. When you use basically the white power structure standards to judge other communities.
So you preemptively answered. Thank you so much. Adrian Garcia Marquez asked this question. I'm going to go ahead and read his question only because he made his case really well in the question. Why hasn't Fernando Valenzuela made it into the Hall of Fame yet? In his case, lack of certain numbers should not be an excuse. He is one of the main reasons why MLB is now dominated by Latinos. Fernando's impact transcends all time and space. So, Gustavo, any other thoughts on this issue? Do you think he should find his way in?
Baseball is, as the prof said, is a number dominated, not just by stats and obsession with stats and numbers, but also just legacy. I mean, this is a sport that you had some great, because of all these numbers, you have someone like, say, Cap Anson. I was just Googling very briefly. Cap Anson's like old school. We're talking about when the Chicago White Sox were known as the White Stockings. Well, Cap Anson was also one of the main reasons why there was a color line in baseball. You have the founding commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who I believe his family was, back in the day, let's just say he was a clan, his family comes with the Confederacy and all that. So these are men by today's standards. Yes, they were important for Major League Baseball, but they're horrible human beings. Here you have with Fernando, someone who's a transcendent figure. I, of course, and you had this debate actually in football with Tom Flores. Tom Flores, the former head coach of the Oakland Raiders, first Latino, Mexican-American no less, to play in the NFL, to win a Super Bowl when he was with the Kansas City Chiefs, to win a Super Bowl twice with the Oakland Raiders and then the LA Raiders as a coach. But his numbers were never really there until finally the Veterans Committee of the NFL elected him into the Hall of Fame. And I think what the NFL realizes that sometimes you have to look a little bit beyond the numbers and you have to take the totality of the person. Okay. And with Fernando, it's not like we're talking about just, nothing against Bobby Castillo, but it's not like we're talking about Bobby Castillo, someone who had like one little thing to contribute to baseball. This is a man who changed the game, who had, when he was on, he was as great and dominating as player as ever. He had 2 World Series titles under his belt. Like, what else do people need? But it's true what the prof said. I do know some Mexican Americans, Marcos Breton. Well, I don't know. Yeah, no, they announced it. They put it on Twitter. Marcos Breton from the Sacramento Bee. He votes in, the current crop for Hall of Famers, but he's not on the Veterans Committee. You have Jose Ortiz from Our Esquina. I know he also votes for baseball for the current props, but this is just in the past 10 to 15 years, you're having more Latinos voting. Like, to have Latinos on the Veterans Committee and to do all of this, it's still going to take a generation to do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, so moving ahead to current times, we have another reader question from Elena Rodriguez. You all may be able to help fill in some blanks for her. She wants to know what Fernando is doing now and what is he like. So, from what you've heard, from what you've seen, what can you all tell Elena about what Fernando is up to now?
I'll jump in really quickly just because, I said at the very top of the show, my experience with Fernando through my family, who's there in Montebello and East LA. They run into him at the golf course right there, Montebello Golf Course, all the time. So he loves to play. Everyone still calls him El Toro. No le dicen Fernando. They don't say call him Fernando. They say El Toro, El Toro. Because that was his nickname, the Bull. By all accounts, a great guy. At this point now, he's like our Theo. He's like our uncle, like a guy who you just go and see on Twitter. A follower of mine posted a photo of him, not a Mexicano, by the way, white guy. He posted a photo. I'm like, let me guess, Montebello Golf Course, because I don't golf. He's like, yep, he's totally nice guy, signed autographs, all that stuff. And of course, he's still with the Dodgers organization. Profe, you can talk a little bit about that.
Oh no, you go ahead, Gustavo.
Yeah, no, he's been the color commentator. He was with Jaime Jarrin, the legend, who's still around, and still that voice is just so sonorous. It's amazing. So he was doing color commentary on the radio broadcast. Now he's doing color commentary for Spectrum One for the Dodgers telecast. So he's very much a member of the Dodgers family. After a couple of years where it was a little bit, when he was let go, it was kind of acrimonious. Fernando didn't go back to the Dodgers for a while. Thankfully, the Dodgers made, especially after the years of Fox and the McCourts, they got to their senses and say, we got to bring back Fernando and we got to make him part of the Dodgers family. So it's been wonderful to see that. And I just hope that the Dodgers, see this and realize still how important he is. And I think they do know that, but if they really knew it, they'd retire his number.
So I think the other thing that's great too is that he's an ambassador for the Dodgers in addition to the color commentary work. So he goes out and does some fan and community events. And I think for someone who has been, as much as Fernandomania is incredible from the outside and so great to see, someone who's been in the middle of it and who's had to experience what was most likely very crazy, could not go anywhere, had to have meals sent to his room on the road because he just was mobbed constantly everywhere he went. He is still very gracious and very humble about these things. And you can see that in all fan interactions. There's so many people who have amazing Fernando stories. As soon as we announced that we were doing the series, we were bombarded with people who were so excited because they continue to this day to have such positive interactions with him. And I think that's a huge piece of his story, is not only did he have all of these gifts, but that he genuinely seems to be having fun when he was playing or when he's interacting. And he just seems nice. I think that really has a big impact.
Today we see so many ball players, Dodger ball players, but other ball players who have all of these charities and events that they have to raise money and so forth. I think of Clayton Kershaw, Turner, others who have these different community programs. One thing I remember being that I was in education, still in education, was that in 1981, Fernando, just coming from Mexico, barely speaking English, very shy, not very outspoken, is that he adopted this stay in school kind of program. And he went to all these different elementary schools and junior high schools and talked with the children, read to them. And it was quite fascinating about Fernando doing this. He didn't get a lot of publicity. He wasn't looking for publicity. He wasn't looking for accolades. But Fernando spent a lot of time, and many of the young people that Fernando spent time with in the classroom, those children and their parents came from Mexico. And some didn't. Some were Mexican Americans. Others were not Mexican Americans, African Americans, whites, Asians, Native Americans. But Fernando found that education was so important that he decided to adopt this program. And he did it for many, many years. And I know that once in a while I'll come across somebody and they'll say, we'll talk baseball, and they'll say, Fernando came to my school. Fernando came to my classroom. And because of him, I decided that I would stay in school and graduate and become something. And there are really countless and countless people in Los Angeles and outside of Los Angeles, because Fernando, wherever he went, when he was on the road, would promote his stay in school and learn. read a book a day kind of program and so forth. So for a person, when somebody made a comment that for a person who wasn't well educated himself in regards to in school and so forth, Fernando made this very heartfelt commitment to spend all his precious time and very generous effort in the Spanish-speaking community, especially at a time in the 70s and 80s when the educational levels of dropouts and low reading scores impacted negatively the Spanish-speaking community. So again, he was a role model.
Okay, so we have a final audience question I want to go to, and it's the hardest one. It's from Michael Wilson. Who is the next Fernando Valenzuela? And I don't know if there is one. What do you all think? Gustavo?
Oh, we have been waiting for that Fernando for 40 years. You get pretenders like Nomar Garcia Parra, Adrian Gonzalez. You had, down here in Angel Stadium, Anthony Rondon, maybe not. Julio Rios, of course, for a while. And he's had a good career. And of course, he's a World Series winner. But it doesn't seem like he's going to be it. I think I think the next Fernando has to be a Mexican-American. Ya tuvimos un Mexicano. We already had a Mexican. But let's get someone from Garfield. Let's get someone from Sure High in Montebello. Let's get someone from Anaheim High School, like that phenom. But you need to be young. You need to come at a time. And I think with Mexicanos, we're always looking for that person that's going to unite a very fractious people. And then they just need to win. Let's not forget, Fernando won the Rookie of the Year and the Cy Young Award, which is something that very few ball players have done in the same season. I don't know. I'm not as much of a baseball. I still watch the games, so I'm not as much of a baseball head as my cousins are, or my brother is. They probably have an answer more than me, but I don't see him out there. I don't know if he ever will come.
I think the next Fernando will not know who that Fernando is, whoever it is, if it's a Julio Rios or Victor Gonzalez. If in 40 years we're still talking about them and we're still seeing the impact that they're having on baseball and in the community, then we can judge it. But that's how we know. That's why Fernando's so great. That's why Fernandomania, even though it was in 81, is that it's a 40-year legacy. We are still feeling the ripples to this day. We're still feeling the undercurrents of Fernandomania in 2021.
That's true. That's so true.
Absolutely true. Well, thank you all. I think we're at about the end of our hour. It has been fascinating, and we could keep you here all night with more and more questions, but I think this is a good place to pause. Really appreciate everyone who joined us. Profe, thank you for coming along. I've heard from social media reactions, people exploding over your analysis so far. They're so excited to hear from you. So really appreciate it. And with Gustavo Arellano, I'm Ileana Limon Romero. We're so happy to have hosted this here with you. You can continue the series. This is just the start, the premiere. You will get to watch this episode again at latimes.com/Fernandomania. That is the home for everything Fernandomania all season. And trust me, this is just the beginning. You'll have a lot more episodes in the series, at least 12. Many more opportunities to interact with us. We are going to be marking all of the moments as it kind of went along. It's a long baseball season, and we hope you join us for all of that. You will be receiving a thank you email as well with the link, just in case you didn't write it down. So thank you so much for joining us for the Los Angeles Times. Good night.
Adios, buenas noches. And thank you for subscribing.